The email came at 7:14 in the morning, while I was still in my car in the parking garage, coffee going cold in the cup holder. It was from the HR system at my mother's company. The company she'd built from nothing, the one she'd signed over to me 3 days before she died. The subject line said, "Access revoked. Account no longer active." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, the way you reread something when your brain refuses to accept the words. I'd been listed as a secondary user on the business account since I was 26. My mother, Eleanor Samuels, had added me herself, sitting at her kitchen table in Oakville with a mug of chamomile tea and a stack of folders, explaining every detail like she was handing me a map to somewhere she knew she wouldn't always be able to take me. She died 8 months later. Ovarian cancer. Stage 4. Diagnosed too late. The company, Samuels Design Group, a mid-sized interior design firm she'd grown over 22 years, passed to me through her will. The notarized, witnessed, very legal will that her lawyer had filed with the court the week after her funeral. So when that email told me my access had been revoked, I sat very still in that parking garage for about 4 minutes. Then I called my father. "Dad," I said, "why can't I get into Mom's business accounts?" There was a pause, a particular kind of pause, not confused, not concerned, measured. "Mara," he said, using the nickname he'd called me since I was small. "There have been some changes. We were going to talk to you about it this weekend." That word landed like a stone. "What kind of changes?" Another pause. "Your stepmother and I have been speaking with the board. There are some financial things we wanted to sort out before, Dad." My voice came out quieter than I expected. "What did you do?" He didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not anger, something colder, clarity. "Come to dinner Sunday," he said finally. "We'll explain everything." I said okay, I said I'd be there. Then I hung up and called my lawyer instead. "My name is Mara Samuels. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed project manager and the sole legal heir to a design firm worth approximately $1.4 million. I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario. I like Tim Hortons dark roast and hiking the Bruce Trail and pretending I'm not as organized as I actually am. I am a person who believes in doing things properly, quietly, without drama. Which is exactly why, when I walked into that Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, I already knew everything. Let me start from the beginning. Or rather, let me start from where it actually began. Not the email, not the locked account. The beginning was my stepmother's garden party, 14 months ago, 6 weeks before my mother got her diagnosis. My father had remarried 4 years earlier. His wife. I'll call her my stepmother, because I've never been able to call her anything warmer. Came from money, married more of it, and had always treated my mother's success with the particular kind of politeness that's actually condescension wearing a blazer. She was pleasant to my face. She asked about my work with the brightness of someone who doesn't actually care about the answer. She called me sweetheart, the way some people say it as a small, soft put-down. At the garden party, I overheard her talking to my father near the rose bushes. I wasn't trying to listen. I was walking back from the washroom. "Eleanor built it, but she's not going to be around to run it forever," she was saying. "And honestly, do you really think Mara has what it takes? She's a project manager, James. She manages other people's work. That's not the same as owning something." My father made a low sound, not a disagreement. More like an uncomfortable acknowledgement. "The structure of the inheritance is worth looking at," she continued, "before it becomes a problem." I walked back to the patio table. I picked up my glass of white wine. I smiled at the right moments for the rest of the afternoon. And I started paying attention. After my mother died, the grief was enormous and specific in the way grief always is. Not a wave, but a series of small, ordinary moments that she was suddenly missing from. The first time I made her lentil soup recipe, and there was no one to call when I got the spices wrong. The first time I drove past her street and my hands moved to turn, before my brain remembered. The company felt like a thread still connecting me to her. The fabric samples in her office still smelled faintly like her perfume. Her handwriting was in the margins of every design file. I had planned to honor her work. I had planned to hire a proper general manager, be involved in creative direction, grow it carefully. My stepmother had apparently planned something else entirely. Over the next few months, she began inserting herself, gently at first, suggesting she help with the administrative transition, since I was still grieving and, she always added this with a tilt of her head, overwhelmed. She offered to liaise with the board on my behalf. She asked if she could review the quarterly financials, just to give me a second set of eyes. I let her look at one report. One, and I made sure it was the one I'd already duplicated. My father called more often, but the calls had a different texture to them. He asked about my workload. He asked if I'd thought about the responsibility of running a company. He said, once quietly, "Your mother worked herself to the bone for that place, Mara. Maybe the kindest thing would be to let someone else carry it for a while." I said I'd think about it. I did not think about it. I was too busy building a case. The thing no one tells you about being methodical is that it looks a lot like being passive. I let them think I was leaning on my stepmother's guidance. I let my father believe his gentle nudges were landing. I made myself seem scattered at the right moments. Forgot to mention I'd spoken to the board directly. Didn't bring up that I'd hired an independent auditor. Never told them I'd had a second conversation with my mother's notary to ensure every document was airtight. And I recorded. Not secretly. In Ontario, one-party consent means I could record any conversation I was part of. I wasn't hiding it. I was just thorough. The recordings weren't dramatic. They were worse than dramatic. They were methodical. My stepmother explaining to my father, in their kitchen on a Tuesday evening while I sat 3 feet away, asking about their trip to Prince Edward Island, that the transfer should be clean before the end of the fiscal year. My father replying that he wasn't sure Mara would look too closely at the paperwork if they framed it the right way. I poured myself more tea. I asked if they'd gone whale watching. What they actually did, what I discovered when I had the auditor go through every document, was layered. They had gone to 2 members of the board and suggested that I, as a grieving and inexperienced heir, was planning to sell the company, was simply slow to act. They used that narrative to get the board to consider a voluntary restructuring. They found a buyer, a development company based in Calgary, and began the paperwork for a share transfer that would have effectively stripped my ownership while appearing, on the surface, to be a legitimate board decision. The keystone of the whole thing was a document my stepmother had drafted, a letter of intent, supposedly signed by me, indicating I was open to sale discussions. I had never signed that letter. My mother's firm had a compliance officer, a practical and unflappable woman I'll call by her job title. She was the one who first noticed the letter didn't match my actual signature on file. She flagged it quietly. She called me directly. I asked her to document everything she'd seen and do nothing else yet. Then I waited. I waited because I wanted them to commit fully. I needed them further in than a question, further in than suspicion. I needed them believe they had already won. The email revoking my account access told me they thought they had. I called my lawyer the morning of that email and said 5 words. "I think they're ready. Go." My lawyer. The best decision I ever made was hiring her the week after my mother's funeral. Had already prepared the filings, an injunction blocking the share transfer, a fraud complaint to the Ontario Securities Commission, a formal challenge to the letter of intent based on the signature analysis from a certified forensic document examiner, a letter to the board that arrived the same day as a call from the compliance officer confirming she'd seen the fabricated document herself. I went to Sunday dinner 2 days later. My stepmother had made roast chicken. The dining room table had fresh flowers. She smiled at me when I walked in, warm and satisfied, the way someone smiles when they believe they have already gotten away with something. "Mara," she said, "we're so glad you came." I sat down. I accepted the glass of water she poured. I listened to her explain, for the next 20 minutes, how the board had unanimously decided. that a structured sale was in the company's best interest, and how she and my father had worked hard to ensure my transition would include a fair settlement. A number she mentioned was approximately 40% of the actual assessed value. She said this like she was doing me a favor. My father sat at the head of the table cutting his chicken, not quite meeting my eyes. I waited until she finished. That's interesting, I said, because the share transfer was blocked this morning. Her fork stopped moving. The Ontario Securities Commission received a complaint Friday. The forensic examiner's report on the forged letter of intent is on file. The board has been notified that the letter they received was fabricated. I picked up my water glass. My lawyer filed everything Thursday. The color left her face in a way I hadn't quite expected. It was almost like watching a tide go out very fast. She started. You forged my signature, I said. I kept my voice level. I wasn't angry, actually. That surprised me in the moment. I just felt very clear. You used a fabricated document to manipulate a corporate board and attempted to transfer ownership of an asset that is legally mine. In Canada, that's fraud. My lawyer is very clear on this. My father put down his fork. Dad. I looked at him for a long moment. You knew. You were in the kitchen on the 14th, talking about the fiscal year timeline. I have the recording. He looked older than I'd ever seen him look. The lines around his eyes deepened and his hands went still on the table, and he seemed to fold in on himself slightly, the way people do when the scaffolding they've been leaning on gives way all at once. He started. You thought I wouldn't notice, I said. Or you thought I wouldn't act. I'm not sure which is worse. My stepmother had recovered enough to try again. Her voice took on a sharp edge. The board had legitimate concerns about your ability to. The board had concerns you're planted, I said. The 2 members you spoke to have already provided statements. She stood up. Her chair scraped back. You're making a serious mistake, Mara. We were trying to protect you. I looked at her. I thought about my mother in her kitchen with her chamomile tea and her folders. I thought about the smell of the design studio, the way it felt to walk through those offices and see her work on every wall. No, I said, you were protecting yourselves. There's a difference. I drove home. I didn't cry, which surprised me a little. I made myself pasta and watched something forgettable on television and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I had known that dinner was coming for weeks. I had been ready. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. The OSC investigation moved at its own pace, which is to say, deliberately and without rushing for anyone's comfort. My father called twice and I let it go to voicemail. My stepmother did not call. I imagined her lawyer was advising her not to. The board, once the full picture emerged, was genuinely appalled. The 2 members she'd approached directly, both of whom she'd convinced I was planning to sell, had not known the letter was forged. They'd acted in what they believed was good faith on false information. When the real sequence of events became clear, they were cooperative and I think embarrassed. The compliance officer received a formal commendation in the end. I wrote it myself. The forensic examiner's report was unambiguous. My signature, the real one, has a specific pressure pattern I developed after a wrist injury in my mid-20s, a slight upward curl on the final letter that is consistent across years of documents. The letter of intent didn't have it. The document examiner said in her report that the forgery was competent but inconsistent with the signatory's established motor patterns. In plain language, someone tried, but I have a weird wrist, and it saved a company. 3 months after the Sunday dinner, I sat in a boardroom in downtown Toronto, across from my stepmother and her lawyer, my father and his lawyer, my lawyer and the OSC investigator. The report was 6 centimeters thick. Her lawyer tried for a while to argue that the letter of intent had been prepared in good faith, that there had been a miscommunication, that her client had believed I'd verbally agreed to the sale discussions. My lawyer placed the recording on the table. My stepmother looked at the recorder for a long moment. Then she looked at me. You recorded private conversations, she said. I was present for all of them, I said. One-party consent is legal in Ontario. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. The settlement that followed was not what she'd planned. My ownership of Samuel's design group was formally and unambiguously confirmed. The share transfer documents were voided. The financial penalties went through a separate civil proceeding, and I won't get into the exact figures, but I'll say this. The 40% fair settlement she'd offered me over roast chicken ended up being the number attached to her own losses. There is a symmetry in that I find satisfying in a quiet way. My father did not fight the findings. He gave his statement and cooperated and looked, throughout every meeting, like a man who had made a series of decisions he wished he could unmake. I don't know what to do with that yet. The grief of it is different from the grief of losing my mother. It's smaller, duller, but it has its own particular weight. He called me, eventually. We had a short conversation. We are not close. I don't know if we ever will be again. That's not a dramatic declaration. It's just where things are. I walked back into my mother's studio on a Tuesday in April, 2 weeks after the final proceeding concluded. The afternoon light was coming through the big windows on the east side, the ones she'd specifically chosen when she designed the space, because she said natural light made every color honest. Her handwriting was still in the margins of the oldest files. Her fabric samples were still in the third drawer of the cabinet by the window. I made chamomile tea in the little kitchen at the back of the office. I sat at her desk. I had a meeting with a new client at 2. A young couple in Mississauga, first home, wanting to make it feel like something. Like somewhere. I pulled up their file and started reading their notes, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. They thought taking the company would break me. They thought I was too quiet, too careful, too buried in grief to see what they were doing. They didn't know that my mother raised me to measure twice before I ever made a single cut.